to look at different aspects and different courses. So as you've already said, I've been doing this for about 25 years already. And I'm going to, in this type of slides, show quite a lot of movies, which you normally should not do in an online presentation. But I think sometimes it does make things a little bit more interesting. So I'll be talking mostly about wearables and what I've been doing with wearables. And I'll go a little bit more specific into one particular type of wearable research field, which is called activity recognition. And before I do that, I want to first of all highlight that most of this work is done by my PhD students. Most of them you'll see here. I'm fortunate enough to have a big group of very intelligent people and very highly active people. And at the end, I will also show a slide where you can follow the people that have been doing most of this work as well as their papers. So please do that as well. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly about wearable sensing. And I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive so you could follow along in your browser as well, which hopefully will be a little bit interactive if everything works correctly. And what I hope to show is that recording sensor data has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and that research here in this field is going in a particular direction that I think is highly interesting, but comes with a couple of pitfalls, but also a lot of rewards. That's more or less what I try to show in this presentation. Now, for those of you who want to think along and also program along, I have this small URL that you could already follow or just type in. It's a Google Colab notebook, Jupyter Notebook, where you can, as soon as we get there to the point, come along and try out yourself interactively in terms of visualization and also dealing with sensor data. So if you have a Google account, you probably need to enter that first, and then you can get into this notebook. That's for later. So as soon as that is done, and I'll show this exact same slide again later, we can continue. Right. So as I was saying, activity recognition is the field that I'm really active in. And this is something that has been there for quite a while. So this is about what happened about 20 years ago. People like myself, in this case, this is work from a master's student when I was a postdoc at the Technical University of Darmstadt. We tag wearable sensors on people as they do particular activities. In this case, 2 sports people that are very well proficient in their sports, left an Olympic gymnast, on the right side, a black belt martial art expert. And as they're doing their training, as they're doing particular movements, we try to pick those movements out as time series from the sensor data. And then the question is, can we find out what these movements look like in that sensor data? So the sensors that we're using here are accelerometers in 3D on particular body parts of these people. And as these people do particular exercises, you should be streaming by particular patterns that repeat themselves over and over again, which can be recognized by an algorithm and which then hopefully can lead to something that is automatically detecting what these people are doing. So for the person that is on the right now doing back rolls, you can, for instance, see that for an earlier exercise, the sensor data looked like this. So the sensor data here came from 3 different types of sensors at the torso, on the wrist, and on the ankle of this person. And if you look at the ankle data from this person over the last 10 seconds, you can see there are loads of movements there that tend to repeat themselves again and again and again. The fact that this is from an ankle, you can already probably guess that this is someone kicking. And you can even count how many times this person was kicking, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And if you look at the patterns of this kick each time, you could perhaps even say what type of kick this was, where the person kicks and, for instance, rotates their foot to the left slightly at the end. And if you take all this data from the ankle, from the wrist, from the torso, you could even do more and, for instance, look at the proficiency of this person, how well this person has now executed this particular movement. So activity recognition is not just about detecting what activity a person is doing from the data, the wearable data of the wearables that this person is wearing. It's much more than that. It's about also predicting what is going to happen. It's about finding out what aims this person has, what are they trying to do, and many more things that you could do this. So it's not just, a very simple classification problem. There's a lot more to it. That's basically what I think is so interesting about activity recognition. And in the next couple of slides, I'll show you my personal path in this research field. So long time ago, 25 years, no, 27 years, meanwhile, I started as a young PhD, computer science master student, doing my thesis with a company called Nokia Research at the time, one of the bigger manufacturers in mobile computing, so mobile cell phones. And the project here was with Nokia to develop a phone that had extra sensors, where the sensors would give you a little bit more of contextual information. So the phone would look or do things differently depending on what it was sensing. So if you had the phone in your pocket, it would ring louder. If you had the phone in your hand, it would just vibrate. If you were running while looking at the phone, the font size would get bigger. So all of these things were implemented. This was like a European project where I was mostly taking care of the embedded system that would take the sensor data and try to recognize what is going on. Now, this type of project launched me into this field more or less because I took those exact same sensors and put them into a wearable fashion. So I basically put them on my leg. And in 2000, I had this paper called "What Shall We Teach Our Pants?" And which basically is asking the question, what if we could have wearables that we could teach certain things as they would observe exactly the same thing that we are observing, but they would be on our body. So if I would be walking down the stairs like here, would I be able to then teach my wearable that this is what walking down the stairs looks like? And that would result in data that would look different depending on what type of activities I would be doing. So if I would be sitting, that data would look different from when I would be standing or walking or running or bicycling. So that is, I think, for me, the eye-opener, or was the eye-opener in the early 2000s, that this would be quite interesting as a research area. Then we fast forward 10 years, or about 10 years, when I arrived at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. I did my PhD, meanwhile, in the United Kingdom. And there I got a research grant for 5 years for my own PhD students to basically start a research project to investigate this deeper on a longer term. So in this research project, which involved quite a lot of money, I was able to hire some people and prototype some early stage of smartwatches. That's what you see on the right here, on the left, sorry. So we created our own microcontroller-based smartwatches around 2010, when there were no smartwatches around really. They would have this OLED display, several sensors, a microcontroller, and you could upload then the data that would locally be stored on a micro SD card to a computer that was attached. And the ideal thing here is that since we completely designed this thing from the ground up, it would last about 2 to 3 weeks nonstop. So day and night, people could wear this. And then after a few weeks, they would then be able to come to us. We would upload that data via USB, and we would have their data. That's what you see here on the right. So we basically have the 3D accelerometer data, the light and temperature data over here, which would allow us then to see when people were sleeping. There's no movement, there's no lights, the temperature, skin temperature goes down a little bit. You would see certain gestures. So there we had quite a lot of research in smoking cessation. So basically people trying to quit smoking. And for that, we had to have a system first that would allow us to detect when a person is smoking, which is fairly simple as long as they're smoking with the hand at which they are wearing the sensor. And the aim of this bigger project was that more complex activities, such as playing tennis or jogging or food intake, would be then also recognized through all of this data. So this way we had quite a lot of data that we recorded through several studies. So we had lots of studies involving sleep laboratories, where we compared this against polysomnography. We had some clinical studies with bipolar patients, and that way we recorded loads and loads of data using this platform. I can quickly perhaps change the view over here and show you some of that data over here. So I hope you can see this is basically a calendar view of one person wearing this data for almost a year. So you can basically see, for all these days in a calendar view, the data that we kind of recorded. So it's exactly the same data that you saw here. So here's the light data and temperature data. Here's what this person was doing during the day. And since this person was cycling, you can just zoom in on the cycling data itself. And this for day and night, basically for several months, for almost a year. So that's what we did in 2010 to 2014, more or less, trying to look at all of this on a longer time scale. And I think from that came my perspective that we need kind of systems that are very powerful, but also where the sensing and the data analysis needs to be done as close as possible. So the more we can do on these smartwatches, the less data we have to transfer to the backend, which typically results in a lot more data and something that is a lot less efficient, because transferring data from these small devices to a backend typically also requires lots of energy, especially if you're doing it wirelessly, but also if you do this via cable, it takes time. People have to come to your computer or somehow have to upload it actively, and that is just a hassle. Typically, it's nicer if you can do this on those embedded systems. Now, this is about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and if we now fast forward to today, our systems look slightly different again. So let me fast forward. We're using now systems that are kind of off the shelf. So again, the world has changed meanwhile in the past couple of years. Most of our wearables are extremely cheap, much better than they used to be. And instead of spending years and years developing our own platforms, we can just buy them. There's quite a lot of platforms that you can buy that can be completely reverse engineered, or where you can at least completely reflash the firmware so that you have a very high-end smartwatch, basically, that you can for which you have the operating system yourself, basically. And for that, I think if you didn't know about this, the Bangle.js is a very good open source smartwatch. It's made by Gordon Williams here in the picture, who basically reverse engineers existing smartwatch designs that are coming typically from China. He reverse engineers the firmware and puts his own firmware on there so that they can be used for fast development. Again, that is extremely interesting, I think. So also there, if you have never seen this before, it basically looks like this. You have an IDE, so like an integrated development environment, which is just on a website. So it's esprino.com IDE. Via Bluetooth low energy, web Bluetooth, you can just, I hope this is the right one, I guess it is, my smartwatch over here, pair it, and then I have a terminal to my smartwatch. So over here, you can just basically look at what the accelerometer on my smartwatch is looking like, or what the data of this looks like as I'm wearing my smartwatch. So basically, this is kind of an SSH prompt, so to say, or console into my smartwatch, and I can do with my smartwatch whatever I want. I can also inject code on it. I can take over the microcontroller on my smartwatch. I can reprogram it on the spot. So there I have something that I could show somewhere. Yeah, here, for instance. So if I connect exactly the same through the web page here, which is kind of a web BLE, I can pair with my smartwatch, and after a while, the data should be streaming in. So now, as I move my smartwatch, I hope you see this more or less. So if I shake it, you can see my smartwatch shaking around. Now, this is nothing new, right? So people could do this, wirelessly, or we could also do this wirelessly a long time ago already. But what is new here is that it's so easy. I can just take over my smartwatch wirelessly via Bluetooth and program it to send me all its accelerometer data, for instance. I could do the same, of course, with the heart rate sensor, with any of that. And all of that is enabled through nowadays extremely nicely designed smartwatches, which are also much nicer to wear than our smartwatches from 12 years ago, and which have a lot more sensors. So this one over here has everything you'd need. So basically it has everything in terms of photoplethysmography, GPS even, and so on and so on. So basically it has become so easy to get all of the sensor data if you compare this to 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. And I think that's extremely exciting. Right. Let me see if I can. Yeah, there we go. So I think that's what we have and are still going through now. It's basically an explosion of not just prototypes, but commercial smartwatches for which many of them we could take over, so to say, in terms of software, so that we don't have the problem anymore that we need to somehow design the hardware and all the mechanics and the fact that it needs to be comfortable and waterproof and so on and so on. Now, this enables loads of things if you think about doing studies with wearables. In activity recognition, typically a study looks like this. You tag a person with a couple of sensors, like this stick figure here in the middle, which hopefully wearable wirelessly are recording the data, and this data is somewhere then put into a backend. So that's what you see here on the right. So basically we store this in the big database. And at the same time, you have a person then also taking note of what this person is doing. So you have both the information of the sensors that are recording what is happening, the information of a person that is observing this person, so that you kind of tag what activity this person is actually doing. And this is all then stored into one big database, the data sets basically that allows us then to try out different algorithms that can automatically take the data from the wearables and then predict what is going on, what activity this person is doing. Now, I'm giving you a couple of examples of the past years of what I've been doing to just show you what these studies typically look like. The first one is called WESAD. It's a very popular meanwhile. I mean, people are using this dataset quite a lot. Datasets, which is not really directly activity recognition, but it's more like emotion recognition, affect recognition, where we had 15 participants going through a trial with two versions, version A and version B, in which they were going through an entire afternoon through different phases. So after a preparation and a baseline phase, they would go through several phases where they would look at funny videos. Basically, that was the amusement phase. Or where that was a stress phase, they had to present to their peers. It's a principle called the 3-year social stress test. So they were stressed as well, and they also could do. They also had to go through meditation phases while wearing wearables. And then the idea or our question was, can we, through the wearable data, then check through which phase they are going? Whether they have a stressful phase, the amusement phase, the meditation phase, etc. So at the time, we basically, that's these dark bars over here during the entire afternoon, people had to fill in some basic questionnaires, which are like the typical questionnaires that you would use here if you go for affect, as well as doing saliva tests. So they would do regularly also saliva tests, so we could also see in the cortisol levels how stressed they really were. And as I said, all while wearing wearables. Now we had two types of wearables. On the left, you can see what they were wearing on their wrists. Maybe some of you are familiar with this Empatica. It's Empatica E4. It's already quite old, but it's still used quite a lot because this is one of those early smartwatch designs for research purposes that people have used a lot. And on the right, you have this medical grade wearable system for which people, had to put on electrodes across their torso, and which would give all the data in a lot a higher resolution typically, but also at a higher sampling rate. So on the left, empathic app typically gives most of the sensors at 50 hertz, so 50 times per second sensor data points for all these sensors. On the right, you have 600 times per second, very similar types of sensor data. And what was surprising out of this study was that if you then try to detect what affective state these people are going through, is that there's not that much difference between the wrist-worn, easy-to-wear wearable and the medical grade, hard-to-wear setup on the right. So if you just look at all the sensors together, that's basically these purple bars over here, you have a bit of a drop. But overall, it still works quite well. So 93% versus 88% or 80% versus 78% is not that much of a drop. And for that, you gain the fact that people just wear something on their wrist and that's it. So that was very surprising at the time. And that kind of spurred us on to look more into this and try to see what else we can do just from a wrist-worn sensor and not having to equip somebody with this entire torso medical grade setup. Another example, which is then 8 years later, so this is a fairly or a bit more recent work, is where we try to look at activity recognition in a lot more detail. So here we try to make a very tricky type of benchmark data set where several participants, so 22, meanwhile there's almost 30 in this data set, wear a camera on their forehead. That's what you see in the lower left. Where on each of their limbs an inertial sensor. So that's what you see streaming by on the right side. And we also film them from the outside, so basically from a certain perspective, so we can still see what they were doing. All while doing several types of activities. We had loads of different workout sessions in different types of environments, in all types of seasons. So you probably should have seen by now winter, summer, spring, and autumn in Germany. And all of that for a large amount of hours. So basically that way we collected loads of types of activities, which would make things a little bit trickier for the algorithms to try to detect these. And we made it really hard. So basically all of these activities are fairly similar. They're all sports or outdoor activities that people could do in a certain setting. But where we could already see that it would be very hard to pick out different types of variations. So you could do sit-ups or sit-ups with a bit more complex routine, same for lunges or push-ups, for instance. You would have long activities, like doing burpees typically spans 10 seconds almost before you've done one repetition. And we've done also types of activities where just with the limb data or just with the visual data, you would not be able to get everything. So for jogging, you, for instance, would not be able to see what your limbs are doing, and therefore the camera on the forehead, the GoPro basically, would not provide all the information, whereas for other types of activities, you would have the opposite. So this was something that we published a bit more than a year ago, and which is also being picked up by the community quite well at the moment. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention this thing on the right. So this is, meanwhile, in its third year. So also this year we'll have again a Kaggle challenge around this data sets. Last year it was picked up quite well. And people, and I'm also there surprised that so many people come up with extremely intelligent ways of getting the most out of these data sets. So there, if you're interested in this, you can search for the WEAR dataset and hopefully or perhaps also participate this year. Right, so wearable data is, I hope I convinced everyone now, is very interesting and it's very easy to get. And it has become really easy to incorporate wearable data in your own studies. So all you need to do is get a participant, slap a wrist-worn watch, for instance, on their wrists, and the data can be starts to roll, so to say, starts being recorded, and all of this data is being recorded. Now, that is the good news, and that's the positive aspect here. The problem is, since it's so easy, a lot of data can be collected straight away. The problem is, or the good thing is also there, for 5 years ago, these were just aggregations. So for instance, you would get only um, the breathing rate or the heart rate per minute, so to say. You would get aggregations or how many steps a person has done in the last minutes from these wearables. That is not the case anymore. These wearables have been um, uh, examined good enough or basically reprogrammed by researchers well enough so that we get the raw data at a much higher rate and at a much higher fidelity. I think that is what has happened or has happened in the last 2 to 3 years. So it's become also easier to get that raw data from a wearable. The problem is there are always possibilities of how to record data, or during this data recording, there are always ways that things can go wrong. And the tools that we have to just inspect for that are not there yet, I would say. So it's easy to record loads and loads of data, weeks of data from dozens of participants. But ensuring that this data is correct is not that easy. So it could be that sometimes the wireless transfer did not work, could be sometimes that the person has worn the sensor in the wrong way, and many other things can go wrong while you do these recordings. And there is not really a tool that enables us to just inspect this data in a very fast fashion. So this goes back to loads of other machine learning problems, I would say. So this is from computer vision. I'm sure many of you know MNIST as a very basic data set that kicked off a lot of computer vision algorithms. Also there, because there's so many images in these data sets, there are some mislabeled instances. So this is definitely not a 4, even though it's organized as a 4. This is definitely not a 7. I would say this is also not a 9, and so on. So there's definitely loads of examples there in the MNIST dataset that are wrongly annotated, for instance. The same way you can say that in ImageNet, originally, there used to be one category of people. And since ImageNet, which you might know as well, was labeled by people just on the internet, you would have a lot of abuse there. And also this was something that in the end led to the category of people being taken completely out of ImageNet. So also there, the fact that there was this huge data set recorded meant that it was very hard to parse this data set and to see, for instance, this abuse straight away. This happened, and only afterwards, as an afterthought, people said, oh, wait a minute, there's this problem in our data set and we have to remove some of our data. And this led to a lot of images being removed from this data set. And like that, there's lots more. Here's a link to a paper, not one of my papers, but an interesting paper, I think, that highlights this problem. Big data sets, which you nowadays need for deep learning, sometimes have data that is not entirely correct. And finding this out for wearable data is very hard. For images like this one over here, you can see this afterwards, but for wearable data, it's not always that easy. So what we need is basically a way for people to interpret the sensor data. That is one problem, I think. And on the other hand, we need to be able to give a tool that allows data to be represented so that people can actually look at this data. And since this data is a lot of data, we need to be able to browse this interactively. And I think that's where typically there is a big bottleneck at the moment. There are no tools that allow us to inspect wearable data, which are time series in most cases, in such a way that they can kind of analyze this in an interactive fashion. And that's where I think there are certain things that already exist, some tricks, so to say, that do make things a lot easier. So here I'm having a basic recipe that I devised there that I think anyone can take. It basically does not require any coding experience. And it's basically about abstracting the data. And this can be done in Python. That's what the Python notebook will show in a second. And in JavaScript, so in an HTML environment, being able to look at the data in an interactive way. So that is the idea here. And that is where I want to quickly go for interactive way of showing this. Now, in the interest of time, I won't be able to go through the entire interactive notebook. but probably all of you have seen this already. So I start with looking at one heartbeat out of the PhysioNet database. So as soon as we load this over here, is one single heartbeat, we can actually just, okay, it needs to mount the Google Drive. It will take a little bit before this little array is then loaded, but we can then inspect it. And I think many of the people that would first do this would just do this in Python and use matplotlib, for instance. And then you can see this is a heartbeat in ECG. You could also do this interactively with Plotly, for instance. Again, you use a library, and then you can basically do this interactively by being able to zoom into certain parts of the heartbeats. Also, this takes a while. And then the problem is, if this becomes really large, saying not just one heartbeat, taking about a second, but an entire day's worth of ECG data, the zooming in over here would take a lot of time. And this would be selecting something and requiring seconds, perhaps even minutes of processing to do this in Plotly. And that is very, very hard. So if you then follow the rest of this mini course in this Python notebook, you'll see that you can actually use this uplot library, which allows you to load data quite quickly. First of all, compress it, but then load it quite quickly into an HTML web page. So then you can start looking at this data in an interactive fashion. And I'm going to fast forward to two examples already that I used as well. So this is from the earlier mentioned WEAR datasets. So you can see here, subject to the participant 0 out of 23 that are currently in the datasets. I can look at that sensor data from that person. I can zoom into that sensor data, and I can start playing that sensor data. So as soon as this, I click on here, the video will start showing. That's the first person view of this person, and also the four sensors showing their sensor data. So I can do this in an interactive fashion. I can move between this data. I can also go to the original data, of course. And this way I can see what data is there for which participants, right? So I can also zoom out a little bit to move my window a little bit so you can see. So I can go to different people. So this would be participant 1, where you can see that the data is completely different, but where I can again go into particular types. So here we go for sit-up, for instance, and if I start reading here, it basically replays the sit-ups of that person. It's a website that you just can go to as well. And I think this interactivity is something that is quite nice. This way, you can immediately see what is in a certain data set and when something is wrong with the data sets. So that's one example. The other one is the WESAD dataset that I just explained. So at the top, you can see this medical grade wearable data. At the bottom, you can see this wrist-worn and Empatica E4 data. It's synchronized, and also here I can zoom into the data so that we can see particular heartbeats, for instance, and we can see whenever something has gone wrong in our data recording. And also that is something we can do for all the participants, right? So there we can go to a different participants, and we can see that for this participant, for instance, the ECG was much better attached to the person. So here you can see the ECG in a much finer detail. Right, so that's basically what I wanted to show with this interactive Python notebook. You can go through the entire thing so that you understand how I did this in principle. And then you can, for instance, for these two datasets, also start searching for mistakes, because we did make mistakes during these datasets as well. And for instance, for WESAD, for the emotion recognition one, you can see where there was a short outage of a sensor. For the WEAR datasets, we had sometimes missing sensor data for one of the participants. So that's the thing that you can do there, where you can see immediately there's a problem here with your data. So I think that is quite interesting. And that's what I wanted to just quite quickly tell in this presentation. Now, then finally, I want to wrap up things by looking at what else we can do with this wearable data. And one of the things that I'm very excited about is that you can synchronize wirelessly this wearable data with environmental sensors. And this is work from a few years ago, where you can, for instance, look at the data from a camera and looking at people, and then basically recognizing those people and recognizing the joints of these people, as well as looking at the wireless data that is coming from wearables that are worn by these people, but you don't know where those are worn. So the question that we asked in this paper was, what if somebody wears a wearable somewhere, and all three people in this view from the camera are doing something very similar, like dancing or giving this head, shoulders, knees, and toes dance, or the Macarena, or they just try to walk in the same pace. What happens then if one person has a wearable which is streaming the data, and from that data you try to figure out who is wearing this wearable and where they are wearing this wearable? As you can see already from the plots down here, this won't take that long. So typically in just a few seconds, by matching this data, and those are basically quaternions that can be obtained from both sides, from the camera as well as from the wearable, you can do this fairly quickly. So I think that is something that is quite interesting for most studies, because that way you can look at environmental data, from a camera outside perspective, looking at a person, and from the wearable wearing this wearables, or from a person wearing these wearables. There's also a lot to be done in terms of miniaturization. So as you saw earlier with this smartwatch that we developed from scratch, we're trying to do this exactly the same way, but then for particular types of sensors that are not commercial yet. For instance, type of a miniature glove where you basically put these IMUs, these initial measurement units, on the fingertips, so you can kind of do captures of a body pose. So like this person playing the piano is something that we can replay, even though this person did it on an actual piano, but we can basically do exactly the same by putting the piano exactly where this person is playing, so to say. And that way we can do body capturing without needing any external sensors. It does require quite a bit of calibration, but once this is there, this type of glove does work quite well. Another thing that you can do with outside cameras, especially if they're depth cameras, is by looking at a person's body posture, then looking at the chest, and from the chest depth information, figure out what respiration rate they have, or the respiration itself. So you can do this at different distances. You can do this also not just for people sitting, but also, or sitting close by, then of course the signal is a lot better, but you can do this for people sitting, standing up while swaying a little bit, and the very hard one, standing up while they're drinking, so they're occluding their chests. And in that case, this tends to work in all cases quite well. So just having a camera focused on a particular person and having lots of people doing this, we could figure out an algorithm that would do this by just filtering out or masking out what is happening in front of the chest, and that way kind of modeling the respiration rate of this person. So this is kind of an overview of what this looks like. So we basically carve out anything that is short changes in front of the chest, so that we kind of see from all the pixels that we can figure out where the chest is, the respiration signal, and therefore also the frequency of the respiration. So that is something that is quite interesting, I think, for any application where a person is standing in front of a screen that has a camera and that has a depth camera meanwhile. And then finally, this of course has loads of implications for the medical fields. So this is some examples from a large study that I was involved in using the empathic AI4 again, of people going to a particular setting. So these were in-hospital patients that were suffering from epilepsy, and that would have very regular epileptic seizures. They would already be observed by the hospital through EEG, ECG, video, sound as well. So that would be very clear whenever they would have a seizure. And they would also be then monitored by our wearable setup, where the aim was, can we then see when the person is going through a seizure or not, just from the wearable data. And so there we found that some modalities are a little bit more important than others, and also the type of seizure is of course extremely important. Not all seizures are these spastic movements. Sometimes you don't see anything happening. People have an aura and then go through a seizure without that much of physical changes. Typically then electrodermal activity, for instance, has some spikes, but that's about it. So also there, I think wearable data can do a lot for us. And I think also there we will see a lot more clinical studies with cheaper wearables for a longer continuous periods that I think are resulting definitely in interesting outcomes. Right, and with that, I thank everyone for their attention, and I encourage you to ask questions, but also to contact me for any questions you might have. And this is how you would be able to see me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Any question from the audience? First question is always the hardest, so maybe let me break the ice. So it's interesting that you actually start working in this field back in 2000 and show us that Nokia phone, which I think many students probably in the audience have never had the chance to interact with. So my question is, if you look at the researching activity, even for tasks such as activity recognition, I mean, clearly the work in ubiquitous computing field has some impact on industry. And you've seen, for example, Apple Watch that has, to some extent that kind of functionality, but like even I can still struggle, like sometimes you cannot tell and standing up and keep, just miscount. So what do you see the field is heading? Like it seems that there's still gap in terms of accuracy, in terms of robustness of different wearing condition, different types of activity. But on the other hand, in academia, it almost feel like if you were to publish a paper in activity recognition, there's a good chance it will maybe get rejected. So we seem to stop at, okay, we have something that somewhat work, but the problem is not entirely resolved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not. So what's your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I think, there's multiple facets around activity recognition. Lots of people have completely gone into the deep learning type of work, where they basically just take data sets from others and get, the best outcomes. But I think there is a lot more to that. And as you said, there is this gap still between commercial applications where activity recognition really works. And there are some cases where the algorithms that we devised ages ago are being used on apps to recognize certain things. And also the other thing is happening. So basically, bigger companies like Apple are devising or building apps that work to recognize particular applications without ever having this as a research field. So like one of my PhD students is doing, for instance, the detection of hand washing, which during COVID was really popular, and where you saw then certain applications or apps emerge, for instance, Apple's, where this was done via sound. And only now we're trying to backtrack and see how much sound can be used from a wrist-worn watch in detection of activities. So there's this, interplay between commercial use and pure research. So I think there are quite a lot of instances where activity recognition, as it was done 10 years ago, is already a product. There are loads of apps that do actually count repetitions from particular types of fitness activities, for instance, or that do detect typical activities for particular purposes. But I think as a whole community, there are loads of holes there. And the one type of activity, or there are loads of different types of activities that definitely cannot be detected yet in the wilds. One very important one, I think, for healthcare especially, is activities of daily living. I think for you, probably this is also quite interesting, right? So there, since 2004, I think, when Intel started with this work, people have tried to detect when people are doing these activities of daily living. I think this is still a completely unsolved problem. And mostly because our wearables are not good enough yet, or the sensors on our wearables do not detect things that are minor changes and would be very hard, I think, to implement as well. So in these type of domains, we are completely still at the infancy of trying to devise systems that automatically detect these things. But on the other hand, there are lots of ways or lots of applications where we do detect certain things quite accurately, and this has been picked up. One other application field is, for instance, sleep. I've been doing a lot of detection in our sleep detection clinical trials as well. I must say that also there, one of the problems has always been that there are loads of gadgets you can buy. There are loads of apps you can load on your smartwatch that promise you that they will detect your sleep in the most accurate form as possible. But this is hardly any, or in most cases, this is not clinically tried out. The problem is that it's very easy to sell these things for very little money. So I think the commercial part is sometimes a little bit coming into the way of the research. So that's why I would say research is definitely necessary, and clinical research with wearables, I think, is definitely needed, as shown by the wearable sleep recognition work. Also there are very good wearable systems that you can buy that have been clinically validated and that show people sleep in detail or in sufficient detail. And I think that's the problem that we're having at the moment. There's this huge field where some things have been solved commercially, others are claimed to be solved commercially but haven't, and others are still a completely open problem. And I think that's the field where we have to navigate through. And the question for us researchers is, what do we do there? Do we go for one particular type of application? Do we just try to fix the detection of epilepsy seizures, for instance? Or do we go for something really big, like we want to detect any activity of daily living? And I think the solution is somewhere in the middle.
So, but do you see the bottleneck is in the data itself? Like it's very impressive that your lab spends so much effort, like actually building those data sets. But despite
Yes.
that, the scale is still relatively limited,
Yes.
like 20 some participants. If you look at in other community, even like vision-based or optical tracker based human pulse estimation, AMAS data set has at least over 200 subjects. So I feel like this community, it seems so not very good, like to put the efforts together, build large data set, partly because there's no standardized device per se. Like every device is a little different as opposed to motion capture system, even though there are different products, but eventually the data is somewhat interchangeable. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. There are some data sets out there, like the UK Biobank, which has thousands of people wearing the same wearable for over a year. Apple has its own, but that is not released, of course. There's also Capture 24. I mean, many of those long-term, many people data sets, however, have the one common problem is that when people go through their normal lives, the activities that they really do are only like little pinpoints here and there, right? So if I would record my life and I would be interested in the activity playing tennis, then this would still be just a couple of dozens of hours, perhaps over an entire year. Or a few months, but that is something that is very little compared to all the other data I would be able to record. And the second problem is getting that data. I would have to say every time I started playing tennis, now I'm starting tennis, and then start playing tennis. And whenever I stop playing tennis, I would have to do this myself as well. And this annotation of the data is another problem, I think. Since there's no visual data that people can interpret, somebody has to do this, and this is typically the user, him or herself. And I think that is requiring from the people wearing these wearables a lot. This is typically not working. People forget to annotate certain things, and then your data set is typically getting harder and harder to maintain. So I think those are the obstacles that we have in our community, and that's also the reason why we only have data sets where we have a couple dozen people at most. And as you go towards larger data sets, like there's the wisdom data set, for instance, or some others that have 50 people, but as you go to more and more people, managing this data is harder and harder. So I think that is still an outstanding problem as well. You're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if there's Dylan, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me? Great talk and great discussion on this. And Ron, I had the same kind of thought as well of the difference between pose estimation and where we're at with sensors. I think the watch makes a good argument for the standardization, but one of the things that we deal with a lot of the time is lower limb sensors, and the challenge there is standardizing that. And right now we do, ankle or shank, but there's thighs, and I think that's some of the challenges that you're alluding to and what that data size can get to. So I wonder if you can comment on like the lower limb a bit of what you like to see, or some of the places that you like to see in that, or would recommend from a standardization side of it.
Yeah. I mean, standardization from the technical point of view is, I think, not that problematic. I mean, just like a wrist-worn watch could be quickly fixed. I mean, if you look at the inertial data, for instance, it would be fairly simple for any smartwatch that has a full IMU to basically standardize this to a set configuration where this would be X, this would be Y, and this would be Z, for instance. And I'm sure you could do this with the same with the ankle as well. I think I see problems in the actual comfort ratings of these things, that people would be able to wear these for prolonged sessions. Back in 2010, 2012, we had exactly the same with our smartwatch prototype. It would be very hard to convince people to wear these things 24/7. And there would be this big habituation period in the beginning. So if they would be able to manage several days of wearing this sensor day and night, then typically that was it. And they would continue to wear this, not a problem. But many people would give up on the first night already, for instance. Especially during the night, people are very annoyed by things they have to wear. And I think these little problems, these, psychological but also mechanical problems in many ways, make this also a very challenging thing to do as a study. And also there are anklet devices that people are designing, but I think there it's still not as well known yet as for the smart watches, the things that people wear on their wrists. So I think that is perhaps one of the bigger problems indeed. But maybe this will change. Also there, I think, back in 2010, when I started this project, I had to convince people that the wrist was a good position for wearables. People were telling me all the time, we're getting rid of our wristwatches because we now finally have our phones, and on the phone we can watch what time it is as well. So why would we never need something on our wrists? That's just annoying. So now many people are wearing still something on the wrist, or more people are even wearing something on the wrist. So who knows what will happen if there are comfortable devices that can be worn on the ankle.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's something that we deal with. The other sort of next piece of this that I was curious about is, again, building these large data sets is really challenging. Even though you can collect the data really well, as you said, that's only a small part of the problem. Have you looked into or thought about like a multi-center type of this? Because it's something that we've thought about, of trying to collect some of these, standardized data sets that can be used for all of this, but it's a challenge. But maybe having multiple groups with a really specific protocol can make that much easier. Is that something you've looked into or thought about? Or
Well, we've had larger studies as well. For instance, like we had a diabetes study with 700 patients. We bought 700 of these devices. Since they were quite cheap, if you buy them in bulk, that would be a possibility. We reprogrammed them and we gave them out to diabetes patients. And the cost of that, I can't recall anymore. It was quite a bit, but since this was a grant, basically this is something you could do as a study. And there, the collection of the data was indeed a lot simpler as you might expect. I think the difficulties are a lot in the monitoring of the people and briefing of the people. As you said, basically, the gathering of the sensor data was not typically a problem. It was mostly tracking people down that wouldn't come to the appointments anymore. People disappearing in many cases as well, and kind of managing the fact that people had to do something as well, like now and then charge their devices and keep on wearing their devices. So that is something that was a huge problem there. So I think it's still something that would require lots of researchers to be behind this and coax the people that are wearing these wearables into following things that they need to do for the study. So that is definitely not a solved problem yet, I would say. But coming from the 2000s, I think a lot has changed already, compared to what we had to go through to create these prototype smartwatches. And seeing the technology that is there now, I think that is a huge leap that we have made as a community. So I would not say that we have hit a ceiling there. Perhaps, also that is something that's with new protocols, with extra help, or also the pervasiveness of wearables can be changed.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so let's thank the speaker again with a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
We hope that we have opportunity to interact with you further.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Please keep in touch. And yeah, as you said, I can also send the slides if this is helpful.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you so much. And have a nice day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.